Nintendo. Undoubtedly one of the greatest and certainly one of the most popular gaming companies out there. It's hard to imagine a lot of video games and the gaming industry today if it weren't for the contributions of Nintendo. The company is well known today, but very few people know of its past. So today, we're going to be going over the history of Nintendo. Nintendo is possibly one of the oldest living companies. It was founded back in 1889, almost 130 years ago. They were known as, at the time, Nintendo Koppai. As you might have guessed, they weren't exactly making video games back then. Their primary focus at the time was making Japanese playing cards. 70 years later, between the years 1963 and 1968, Nintendo opened a taxi company, a hotel chain, and a company selling instant rice. Kinda strange for a company that would end up making video games and consoles. These companies were doomed to fail, and eventually, they did just that. Nintendo took its first steps into the gaming industry with the release of arcade titles such as EVR Race in 1975 and Radar Scope in 1979. A year later, in 1980, Nintendo released the Game & Watch, one of Nintendo's first handheld games, that would later become a franchise. The following year, in 1981, Nintendo released Donkey Kong. They went on to release their first cartridge-based gaming console, the Famicom, in 1983. Doesn't sound very familiar? That's because it was only released in Japan. The Famicom actually did really well, but that didn't really matter, since all sold units were later recalled due to a malfunctioning chip. In 1985, Nintendo decided to bring the Famicom to the rest of the world. This new globally accessible Famicom was called, you guessed it, the Nintendo Entertainment System, NES for short. Later that year, Super Mario Bros. Was released and made available for this console. The following year, Nintendo released Metroid, Super Mario Bros. 2, and The Legend of Zelda. By this point in time, it was clear that Nintendo had made their mark in terms of gaming, but they were nowhere near finished. The Game Boy premiered in 1989, along with Tetris, the game that it came with. The Game Boy is probably the best product Nintendo has ever made, because not only is it the best-selling handheld system Nintendo has ever made, but it's the best-selling handheld system ever made. In 1990, the Super Famicom was made available to Japan and to the US a year later, under the name Super Nintendo Entertainment System. 4 years later, in 1995, the Virtual Boy was released. It was supposed to be the first portable 3D gaming system, but ended up becoming Nintendo's first major flop, which is probably why it was discontinued the following year. But, Nintendo had another trick up their sleeves. The Virtual Boy was replaced with the Nintendo 64 in 1996. This system got anything but a bad reception. 500,000 units were sold on the first day of release. Yeah, that's a lot. The game Pocket Monsters was also released in this year. We know this game today as Pokémon, one of the best video game franchises of all time. Nintendo decided to continue making gaming systems, which led to the release of the Game Boy Color in 1998, and the Game Boy Advance 3 years later, in 2001. It's worth noting that the well-known GameCube was also released in this year. The Nintendo DS tagged along in 2004, and along with it, a touchscreen display and the ability to create 3D graphics. The Nintendo Wii came out in late 2006. It was a breakthrough for Nintendo, as it sold incredibly well. Early 2011 saw the release of the Nintendo 3DS. It didn't require 3D glasses for 3D effect, and instead used autostereoscopic technology, specifically known as a parallax barrier. Whatever that is. Nintendo released the Wii U near the end of 2012. It came with 1080p HD game support, a new controller with a touchscreen display, accelerometer, camera, gyroscope, and microphone. That's a lot. In late 2016, Nintendo revealed the widely known and loved Nintendo Switch. You probably know too much about the console, so I won't go into detail. It was released the following year in March, and has to be one of Nintendo's greatest creations to date. But anyway, that was the history of Nintendo. Now before I take my leave, I'd like to thank TimDude12 for suggesting a topic related to this video. His channel link is in the description, go check out his content. That's all for this video, I'll see you in the next one.